I'm so excited to be here. This is one of my favorite things to talk about, so I hope y'all are ready for a whole lot of info. Welcome from Rio Honda. Yes, and I just got a message that I'm not the only one having technical difficulties. So let me see if maybe I am the cause of that. I wonder, we figured out, yep, it's my fault. There we go. See if you can, folks, if you want to turn your cameras on, somehow it's defaulting to not letting people turn their cameras on these days. I don't know what that's all about. So welcome in. It's just 3 minutes after, and because of the confusion with Eventbrite, I want to make sure folks have a chance to sign in. I hope you got, I'm sorry for all the emails, but I wanted to make sure that folks got the correct link for this session. So yeah, we are well represented. Yeah, go ahead. Tracy, welcome.
Yeah, may I welcome you and everybody while you're waiting to start. So hi, everybody. I'm Tracy Burt. I'm coordinating the Teach for the Bay conference. I'm really happy to see so many different people here. And I just want to thank Rosemary. Rosemary always does these amazing workshops for the conference. She's doing 2 workshops, and I always love being able to visit for a while and learn. So I just want to say that it's so important that you're here, and educators are so important in our world. I mean, we are really the solution to all the ills of our world. I mean, I think that obviously there's other solutions, but we are supporting the students at all different ages who are going to create the solutions that are going to make a different world for us, because that's what we need to do, right? We need to be engaged in the world that we're in, which is burning on so many levels, literally and figuratively, and being here and showing up is part of that work. And together we can do it with our connections. And so thank you, Rosemary, for being here. Thank you, everybody, for being here at Teach for the Bay. And I'm going to stick around for a bit.
Thank you so much,
Tracy. Any questions? Sorry. Yes, of course.
Thank you so much. And I don't know how many of you have ever been involved in coordinating an event like this. It's a real education in and of itself, and it's a lot of work. So I just want to put a lot of appreciation out there to Tracy and her colleagues who've been working so hard to make this come together. You know, none of us has had a lot of fun during this pandemic, but I do think that one of the good things that has come out of our emergency transition online is opportunities like this, where we can get together across the state, across the nation, and not have to spend hundreds of dollars to do it. And so I know that I have learned from some of the most amazing scholars over the last 3 years, only because I had access in this way. So yes, we miss seeing everyone in person, but I love being able to connect with all of you all through this medium. And I was actually a full-time graduate student in Zoom before COVID hit. So when we went online, for me, it was like, okay, now I just have to move everything else online. So I know I got an easy on-ramp into Zoom and Canvas. So I know it's been a shock for everyone, but I'm so glad to be able to connect with you all. My name is Rosemary Wrenn. You can call me Rosemary. You can call me just whatever you call me, just be nice. And I use she, her pronouns. I am up here in San Luis Obispo in Shell Beach, and I work until Friday at Cuesta and Cal Poly SLO. And on Monday, I start a new job with the Commission on Teacher Credentialing. So I'm really excited about that opportunity. But teacher preparation is my joy and my passion right now, and especially creating learning spaces that are culturally affirming for our young people. And one of the ways we do that is through our children's literature choices. So I'm going to share my screen. I apologize in advance if you get a bunch of gibberish up here. And oh, it went right to it. Okay, so today my topic that I'm going to share with you is about children's literature and the dire importance of what we offer our children as far as what we have for them in our classrooms and in our home libraries. the thing about children's literature is we're the gatekeepers, like it or not. And so we exert we have a lot of power here. And so what I'm going to share with you today might bust open some doors, might push you a little bit. But remember, what Tracy was saying is so true. Teachers are the ones who can save the world. And I don't say that lightly, because you all and we all are the ones who have the opportunity to provide this and future generations with the tools that they need to be civically engaged. Not engaging in tough conversations and addressing issues like race and bias and other elements of identity is what's gotten us into our mess that we're in right now. And so I really, I'm going to challenge you throughout this presentation. This is not all about Goodnight Moon. I'm just going to tell you that right up. I'm going to say some stuff that might make you mad today, but I hope you'll stick with me, and I hope that you will ask me questions throughout. I am solo on the presentation, so I do have chat ups to watch, but if you've put something in there and I'm not responding to it, feel free to unmute and ask your question. This is for you. So I have a list of things I want to go over, but you know, it's your event. So please let me know. But before I go any further, I do want to acknowledge the land that I am on, which is that of the Yaktitu Yaktilhini Northern Chumash, who are the original, current, and future caretakers of the land and culture, not only of my campuses, but also of my home. In fact, my home is on the site of one of the larger Chumash settlements. And so I take this connection to the land very seriously. I gratefully acknowledge, respect, and thank the Yaktitu Yaktilhini Northern Chumash tribe of San Luis Obispo County and region, in whose homeland I am a guest. And if you haven't learned whose land you're on right yet, I encourage you to check out nativeland.ca and find out a little bit more about the people whose land you're on. I really encourage you also to find out how can you be involved in the people who are the original caregivers of the land that you are on. And in my situation, we have this incredible opportunity with the National Marine Sanctuary proposal that's been put forth by the Northern Chumash tribe, which is the first marine sanctuary proposed by an indigenous tribe. And so right here, we have Fred Collins, who passed away just a year ago, and he was a chief, and his daughter Violet is carrying on his work. And so I encourage you, if you want to find out more about it, you can find out more about this particular project. And what this is doing is protecting the sea and the land area of the Northern Chumash, and also for all of the rest of us. So not only are we looking to preserve this for cultural reasons, but also for the benefit of all of those who happen to be here right now. So I encourage you, wherever you are, to go beyond a land acknowledgement and see how you can get engaged. Even if you don't have a penny to give, maybe you can write a letter to the editor, or just show up at an event and work a booth for a project in your area. So I share this with you because I want to give you some more ideas about ways that you can give back. This is a slide about me. That's not what we're here to talk about, but in case you want to know what I'm up to, I have taught, I can say now, everything from preschool through graduate school. And I love everything and everyone in between. I'm really interested in critical pedagogies and preparing educators to be prepared to deal with creating inclusive, equitable learning spaces. I also have been working in understanding ethnic studies, not only in that 9th grade required class that's evolving, but also how do we weave it in throughout the K-12 experience. And so if you weren't in my talk this morning about culturally sustaining pedagogies, you might want to check that out. I'm going to reference it here in just a moment, but I do talk about how do we make classrooms relevant to our students. And the first thing is to find out who they are. I am a white person, I'm a white woman, and with that comes all my baggage and my proclivity to make mistakes. And if I do make mistakes throughout this, or I say something that rubs you the wrong way, that is, you find is a microaggression, please call it to my attention. I cannot anticipate everything that I mess up, but I can work to improve it and to make amends. So I am very serious about that too. So in that context, I'm going to launch into what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to touch on culturally sustaining pedagogy, and pedagogy is just the way we teach, the way we set up the environment in our learning space. We'll talk a little, we're going to talk about something that you may have heard this term of windows, mirrors, and sliding glass doors. I'm going to introduce you to the scholar who is responsible for that. Going to talk about good children's literature and then the bad and the ugly. And you might be surprised. There's a reason I'm not asking you what your favorite book is right now, because I don't want you to think that you made a poor choice about what you put down there. And I don't mean to bash on anybody's favorite books, but I want to introduce you to ways that you might want to be looking at things. And then I have a bunch of suggestions. Also, I have this slide deck will be available to you. And in the slides are a ton of links embedded throughout. So go ahead, take notes, screenshots, whatever, but you will have access to the slides after the presentation. So just real quickly, culturally sustaining pedagogy, the reason that you're like, this is about children's literature, why are we talking about this? Because the books we choose contribute to our classroom environment and or our home library. And culturally sustaining pedagogy means we're honoring and welcoming in and integrating children's ways of knowing and their funds of knowledge. And that includes their language. And our state and our country have a real emphasis and prioritization of English language, to the point where we aren't cultivating children's home languages if it's something other than English. And I'm going to argue with you right now on many, many levels that we've racialized especially our Spanish speakers and our Mixteco speakers, and pretty much any person whose home language is not English. And I think that we have to talk about language when we're looking at literature, because we're looking at what are we modeling. When we're reading a book, we're modeling something for our children or inviting them into a world. So it's important that we value everyone's language, because we know if we develop language in our home language, that's going to support and help us to grow it in another language. And if we look at our children who come into our kindergartens, our preschools, our first and second grades, speaking languages other than English, and the fact that by the end of the year, they're functioning in English, that is mind-boggling. For those of you who have gone through that, I applaud you and I admire that. And we know that children who have more than one language have far more capacity for problem solving and analysis. And so I want us to really value our young people who do come to us speaking multiple languages. And I just briefly want to point out to you some of the elements that we look at in culturally sustained pedagogies. And this is all from Lorena Germán, who is a scholar who has created this incredible resource for all of us. It's called Textured Teaching. And she was part of the original group of people that were building off of culturally relevant and responsive pedagogies into culturally sustaining pedagogies. And she's built a framework that is based on these three values: truth and knowledge, justice, love, and community. So really making sure that everything we bring into our classroom experience or wherever our classroom, our learning space, is grounded in those three things. Because don't kids deserve all those things? And think about if we treat children with these values, how they might treat one another and us as well. And then the four things on the outside are the traits of culturally sustaining pedagogy, or what Lorena calls textured teaching. It's flexible, it's experiential, it's based on like our physical and engagement. It's interdisciplinary, so mixing up math and science and history and literature. I'm going to show you how you do that. And then it's student driven and community centered. And this, So student driven and community centered. Remember I mentioned how powerful we are as the people choosing the books, and teachers have so much power, even if you're using a scripted curriculum. We get to decide how we're going to present it. We get to decide who to call on, and we get to decide whose answer is correct and whose knowledge we value. So this is a big challenge to step away from that and look at our students and go, that's a great idea. Maybe I'll pick up on that. And in relation to children's literature, what that would mean is finding out what our kids are interested in and pick books that reflect that for them, or that reflect their identities, or that navigate a problem that's going on in the classroom, whatever it is. So I introduced you to that, and there's a lot more where that came from. Check out Lorena, she is brilliant. And so why we care about culturally sustaining practices and representation in literature is for these reasons. We know that when children feel represented and see themselves in the curriculum, in the literature, that they can engage their power, they're resilient, they take academic chances because they feel safe. They validate their identity, and they're not there thinking there's something wrong with them and that they don't belong in the classroom, or worse, in the world. I say that with a very heavy heart, on reflecting on how many young people don't think they should even be here. And you might think, oh, come on, I teach preschool. What does that have to do with me? It has everything to do with us, because it starts the minute a child is in our care. And I know every one of you who's on here today loves and cares for children. And so I am confident that you are the people affirming their identities and validating their feelings and paying attention to them. And so that's why we need really strong voices from all of you here. And we need diverse books. This is from a sequence of shots, and I liked it because folks who are people of color, who have different ethnic backgrounds besides white, European, need to see that they count in the stories that we're telling. And they aren't just there to check off a diversity requirement, okay? That there are fully developed characters, because we know that race is a socially constructed thing. It is socially constructed, it has real and dire consequences, but this whole race thing is all made up. And so we need to have representation of whole people who look different from one another. And so I want to give full credit to Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop for a really important way of looking at literature. And I'm going to play this video. I hope that it all works out for you, because I want you to hear it in her words. And you may have seen this before. It's just a very brief one. And then in the slides is a link to her original article. And so hopefully this works. Sorry. Let's try one more time.
We need diverse books because we need books in which children can find themselves, see reflections of themselves. I wrote a piece, maybe 1990 it was published, which I called Mirrors, Windows, and Sliding Glass Doors. And I think that's really why children need to see themselves reflected, but books can also be windows, and so you can look through and see other worlds and see how they match up or don't match up to your own. But the sliding glass door allows you to enter that world as well. And so that's the reason that the diversity needs to go both ways. I mean, it's not just children who have been underrepresented and marginalized who need these books. It's also the children who always find their mirrors in the books and therefore get an exaggerated sense of their own self-worth and a false sense of what the world is like, because it's becoming more and more colorful and diverse as time goes on. So I think that's why.
All right, so she's very, very modest, and I hope that you will take a moment to read this article when you get a chance, because it does expand on what she just said. And I think she's so diplomatic the way she tells us that children who are so used to seeing ourselves, like myself, represented, it's imperative that I know I'm not the only thing on the planet, right? And that can only help me throughout the rest of my school career, but also all the way through career, because I'm going to have to interact with people whose lived experiences are different than mine. So if I start here in school with a caring and loving teacher, it's a really great way to go. So I want to show you some interesting statistics about representation in children's books. And you may have seen these before, but it never ceases to amaze me when I take a look at this. So in 2015, this group has done this study on children's books and found that 73% of the characters were white. 12.5% were animals and trucks. So you are more likely, if you are a child who is not white, you are more likely to find a book about a bunny or a truck than you are to find about a character that looks like you. And that was in 2015. So in 3 years later, we see a difference here in the white kid representation. We don't see a whole lot of difference over here. We're still seeing very little representation. If you put them side by side, who got the biggest bump between 2015 and 2018? Oh, I'm so sorry. Take a look there. Can you see? I don't know if you can see the numbers. Well, animals and trucks doubled in size, while the representation of actual children kind of didn't really move a whole lot. And one of the reasons for that is it's a whole lot less controversial to have a bunny or a truck as the main character. It's also, not to be cynical here, I mean, almost any child can find something in the character then that they can connect to. But keep that in mind, that folks were more willing to represent more bunnies, trucks, bears, trains, whatever you want to call it, than to really better represent the children who are reading these books. So I want to ask you briefly, and I would love it if you could do this as a waterfall chat or just in the chat, is looking back on your favorite books as a child, were they mirrors, windows, or sliding glass doors? And you can just put one of those words in the chat. I'd just love to see what we've got here. So did you see yourself in the character? That would be a mirror. Or were you always looking at somebody else's story? So go ahead and type in chat. So I have windows, thank you. Mirror, mirror, window, door. I love the door thing. I love inviting someone in. Okay, so we have a pretty good distribution here. It's always one of the questions I ask at the beginning of my lit class is, you know, did you see yourself represented in the stories that you read as a child? And most of my students tell me no. And that they didn't read a book about someone who looked like them until like high school or college, if ever. All right, so I'm going to ask you to all take a deep breath because I'm about to share some stuff that you may or may not like. And if you sign off after this, that's okay. But I just want to prepare you that I might be saying some stuff you don't love about me. And that is looking at some things that we find in children's literature that's really problematic and in fact, harmful. And I'm using a couple of examples that I think you might recognize. And this is just kind of, you consider it the tip of the iceberg. So Skippy John Jones, first of all, is a book somehow I missed. I don't know how I missed it entirely. I think my kids were too old and I wasn't teaching a primary grade at the time. And I know it's a really popular book. And it's actually the reason I stopped asking people what their favorite book was, because a bunch of my students said Skippy John. And then later in the semester found out that it had these issues with it. And then they felt bad. So I don't mean to make you feel bad if you like this story, but I want you, this is a story about a little Chihuahua who has this alter ego of being a little kind of bandit, which is just full of stereotypes of Mexicans as bandits, putting Mexico and Spanish in the past, making fun of Spanish as a language. And it's just all around, it's really problematic. It's perpetuating a lot of really negative stereotypes. And I have included a link to well, no, I think I didn't. Oh yeah, there is a link to the video that's really horrible about Frito Bandito. So until the early 70s, there was a character that advertised Fritos corn chips, and it was Frito Bandito, and that's him right there in that picture. And I really feel like Skippy John Jones is related because he talks just like Frito Bandito. And Frito Bandito was so bad that even in the 70s, that Frito-Lay stopped using it as a tool in their advertising. But what I'm saying is this was targeted at kids. And this is teaching children that it's okay to talk like folks of Mexican descent like this. And one of my students, when I shared this slide, was like, does that say kids? And yes, it does. And it's supposed to say kids, right? So these are, I want you to understand that I'm sharing a link to this video so you can see it if you are older or if you're younger than I am. I am in no way condoning what is going on in that video. It's horrible. But I have to admit that I can sing the whole Frito Bandito song because I grew up watching that on TV. And that's how much it gets stuck in your head. All right. And then we look at a story like The Five Chinese Brothers. And this one has some issues because it is based on a traditional Chinese tale. But there are, again, a ton of stereotypes being perpetuated. And the person who wrote this is a white woman. Okay. And in this book, just some of the stereotypes are that all Asian folks look alike, that they have poor vision because of the shapes of their eyes. It puts them all in the past, which again, it was a legend. So it's kind of a traditional story. And it also portrays Asian folks as sneaky and manipulative and deceitful. So again, do we want to be putting these ideas and reinforcing these ideas in our young people, or can we find a better book? And then we have Dr. Seuss. So this here is a little video that I'm going to leave it up to you to view. And full disclosure, this is information that I have been working with since before the publisher decided to stop publishing some of the Dr. Seuss books, before the big outcry and ham and eggs being read on the House of Representatives floor. So this has been a part of the conversation. Dr. Seuss, people have been reflecting on this for some time. And I will tell you that I am having a hard time with the Dr. Seuss situation because I learned to read from Dr. Seuss. I taught my sister how to read from Dr. Seuss. I had Dr. Seuss posters all over my classroom, and my daughter was the Cat in the Hat and Seussical. So I love the way Dr. Seuss worked for me. But I didn't realize a lot of the messages that I was getting as a young person and that I was sharing with young people. And this is from the book, If I Ran the Zoo, which my sisters and I spent so much time reading. We loved this book. But if you start to look at the pictures, you can start to see some of the problems. Now, we know that Dr. Seuss was creating during a time of a lot of anti-Asian sentiment, which has pretty much been the whole history of this country. And so his depictions of Asian folk are very caricature. But let's take a look at, this is a story about this person who's going out collecting things to put in a zoo. And in this first picture over here, we have three men who are dressed caricatures of Asian folks who are just happily walking along with this big, huge creature on the top of their head with the zookeeper on top, this white guy with a gun. Okay, and he's clearly, and like, they don't seem to care, right? And that's the way the dominant culture is going to want us to think about it. This middle picture really made me when I looked at it more critically, here's this funky looking creature. Well, the text that goes with this picture is he's not just collecting the creature, he's collecting the writer as well. And here we have a caricature of a person with a large nose and a head wrap, and we can kind of start. One might argue, oh, that doesn't represent any particular nationality or race. Well, yeah, it does. And the idea that we would be collecting human beings to put into our zoo, regardless, is a really scary idea to be putting in children's minds. And then this third one, which is kind of funky because in order to fit on the page, they basically, this creature, its head goes, it's like a really tall, long-necked creature. And that's the creature being collected, but the two characters carrying it are not monkeys, they're people. And this is how Dr. Seuss is depicting people from the continent of Africa. And so that's a real problem here that we have. And again, it's not explicitly saying or calling any derogatory names, but it's putting in the minds of very, very impressionable young people that this is how we refer to folks who are not white. And actually, If I Ran the Zoo is one of the books that the publisher no longer publishes because it does have such problematic and racist images in it. So I am pretty sure if you all have been in the world over the last year or two, you've heard a big, huge outcry about people freaking out over banning books and like, oh my God, you're canceling Dr. Seuss. How can you cancel Green Eggs and Ham? And first off, I want to deal with that term cancel, because when people are making choices based on values, that's people making choices based on values. I'm not sure how we're really canceling anything, but we can make choices in our classrooms and in our libraries about what we offer. But one of the reasons, in the article that I mentioned on the Chinese brothers story, we have an emotionality with these things. Like I told you, these three pictures represent books that I loved, that I used in my classrooms, that I read to my children. Little House on the Prairie, I read that series, I don't even know how many times, the whole series. I love those stories. I got lost in them. But each of these are dealing with things through a lens that is not constructive. Island of the Blue Dolphins has won so many awards and is a beautifully written book, but it's written by a white guy about his idea of what the indigenous peoples of the Channel Islands were like. And he doesn't get much of it very right. So we need to, like I said, it's hard for me, really hard for me to tell you these things because I love these books. But I also realize that they're not constructive and that there are better resources out there. There are people who can write about these cultures in a more constructive and factual way. Tradition, we need to release that. And we need to look at, again, who's in our room, who's going to benefit from the stories that we share, and who gets to decide. Again, as the adults, when we're dealing with children's literature, kids don't get to pick the books. Even if you say, oh yeah, I let my kid pick the books all the time. Yeah, but you give them choices, you know, what's available to pick from. The grown-up figures that out. So we want to look for books that are written by folks from that community. It's not saying that if I'm a white person, I cannot write a story about an indigenous person, but I better have exhausted all other resources and make sure that I partner very closely with someone from that culture if I'm going to sign on to write a story about it. So the first choice is going to be someone who lives that experience. And there's a hashtag Own Voices. It's this group of folks who they kind of, I say own voices makes good choices. So if you can find books written by the people that the story's about, that's your best option. And it's getting easier if you look for them. You know, it just takes looking for them. And in the end of the slideshow, I give you a lot of resources for finding books that can meet these criteria. even a book written by someone from that culture. So this is an incredible book. It's called The Undefeated, and it's a poem by Kwame Alexander. But together with Kadir Nelson, they illustrated the poem, and it is, I mean, you can kind of, it's one of those books where you feel like you can just reach in and touch the pictures. There's some beautiful illustrations, and it's a really powerful poem. And it talks about Black folk from all different lives and different achievements. But even that book that covers such a great cross-section of a group of folks, that still doesn't tell the whole story. Okay, so we want to be looking for a variety of representations from throughout a culture. And so on this slide, and like I said, you'll get the whole slide deck later. I'll put it in the chat at the end. These are some things that I encourage you to look at when you're looking at children's literature to see, am I choosing diverse and representative literature? So basically look for characters who are fuller than just a name or just a physical description. So what I mean by that is the young person the sidekick, or do they have like more to them than just being the sidekick? Are they filling some stereotypical role? So look for that. And we're the grownups. We can find those stereotypes and look for them and get rid of them. But most importantly, our kids have got to see themselves in the books. And this sign that she's holding is, we need diverse books because I want my boys to grow up in a world where they never feel invisible. And I want you to think about what that means. If our children aren't seeing themselves, they think they don't matter. And as Dr. Bettina Love tells us, we should not be in a classroom if we can't make our kids matter. And that starts with learning their names, and then it goes on to making sure that the curriculum we offer includes them in the picture. Oops, sorry about that. My slide kind of got weird there. So we need to see ourselves. And this page, I've got some books that I would bet would get a conversation going in your classroom and with your families and your children's caregivers. And these are 3 books that talk about gender identity. And we have everything from a little boy who wants to be the fairy in the Carnival parade. We have I Am Jazz, is a little boy who is assigned female at birth and realizes very early on that they want to be, it's a child who's assigned male at birth and realizes they want to be female. And then we have Julian is a Mermaid, which is also a story about a child who is exploring different identities and ways of being. And these are books we read in my literature class, my children's lit class. And in the very first time I shared this book, I had someone say, but are kids ready for that? Won't that be confusing? And that's often the argument we get. And in fact, LGBTQIA books are or characters in books are the most frequently banned. So I want you to think about what that means, about what are people so afraid of to validate children's identities. And what I would say is when someone said, aren't they too young? Isn't that confusing? And I turn that question around and I encourage you to think about this. Isn't it confusing for the child who has those feelings to never see themselves in a book? And we know that the rates of self-harm and suicide are much higher in children who do have these identities, who do not feel validated. And even just one adult in their life who can validate their identity can make a difference. So I encourage you to consider how you can make different examples of different identities available to all of the children. And going back to the mirrors and the windows and the sliding glass doors, these children desperately need mirrors, but the children who have no sense of this need that window. They need to know there's more than one way that they and their pals might be. The benefit with both Julian and Carlos, well, Carlos is a fully bilingual book, and it's a really cool book because Carlos lives in the US and has never been to Carnival, and he doesn't even speak Spanish. And so it's really cool story because I think that we have a lot of students who are second or third generation, and perhaps their families don't speak Spanish at home, but then they go to visit a grandma or another family member in another country, and they're all of a sudden they don't understand the language. So it's a great story to share on many different levels. So I know that a lot of folks will get pushback on sharing these books, but I think these are really important because we can literally save lives. And I'm not exaggerating in that regard at all. So in Carlos and Dream, that's looking at identities. I also want to look at language and normalizing translanguaging and bilingualism. Okay, so these are just 3 books that I have in my own library that are Carlos and Call Me Tree are straight bilingual books. So there is the text in English and there's the text in Spanish. Okay, and then Dreamers by Yuyi Morales is actually her own migration story and her own story of coming to San Francisco with nothing, no English, nothing. And she ends up finding the library, and the librarians embrace her and help her and her child become more comfortable, learn English and all of that. But there's so much to love in all of these books. And in Dreamers, she goes in and out of Spanish and English. So it's translanguaging is when we go in and out of multiple languages. And that's how our language is developing. And so for kids to see, oh, look, it's not weird that I use Spanish and English together, or Chinese and English, whatever they're speaking. And it normalizes these things. One of our big jobs is to show kids they're not alone. Call Me Tree is just an awesome book. It's also a yoga book. I teach yoga to adults and children, and I use that book all the time in my children's classes. So these are all really great resources for your classroom. Another incredible amount of literature that's coming out is work by Indigenous folks that is getting recognized finally. And this is a tremendous, useful book called We Are Grateful. And it is written in Cherokee and English. It is written and illustrated by 2 Indigenous women. And there's a lot to love about this book. And one of the biggest things is to use it during our Thanksgiving season. To counter the myth of Thanksgiving that we've perpetuated for quite some time, and to take Indigenous folks out of the past and show how they enjoy life in our communities. They're all around us. There are a bunch of you probably in this talk right now too. And it's really a great book because, like I said, it has all it has the phonetic and Cherokee writing of each of the words. It represents families in all different permutations and doing contemporary things, but then it also illustrates this very, very important tradition in the culture. And it's showing folks in all different kinds of traditional and contemporary dress. And this is the circle stomp dance, which actually is very intentional in who's in line where, because it starts with the oldest, the greatest elder, and then goes in a spiral to the youngest. So anyhow, there's a lot here, and showing like being thankful is wonderful, but putting Indigenous folks in the past and perpetuating this myth of the Mayflower and the first Thanksgiving is really, really damaging. And we need to get away from that and look at how can we promote thankfulness in other ways. In my morning session, I talked about this book, Show Way, which is written by Jacqueline Woodson, and it's actually a family memoir. And it talks about the resilience of enslaved women, and how it talks about it's actually her whole family lineage, going all the way back to the first person that was kidnapped and brought to this continent. And it tells a story of how the women throughout her family created these quilts initially as a map for the Underground Railroad, and ultimately continue to pass the tradition on through the years till it gets to the author herself. There's so many wonderful things about this. Earlier today, I shared about how my daughter and I talked about how this went into a math unit on geometry that coincided with Black History Month. And in her class, she has several children who are of African-American heritage, but mostly young people who are Latinx. And so she used it as a way of teaching about the Black history and this history of enslavement and the joy and the pain and the resilience of enslaved folks, but then took the idea of the family memoir and drew that out so it related to her students. And then also, ultimately, the kids made a quilt with a needle and thread in second grade. That was a little wild, but they worked with shapes. And so I use this as an example, just one quick example. You've got literature, you've got history, you've got art, you've got math, you've got language. So picture books are just magical, no matter what grade you're teaching. We Are Water Protectors is the first book by an Indigenous author and illustrator to win the Caldecott Medal, which is the medal for outstanding illustrations in a children's book. So it is about the Dakota Access Pipeline with a tremendous amount of imagery and history and culture woven in. This is the cover of the book, and it's based on this picture right here. And if we look at the actual picture of what was happening during the protest, we have this young woman holding up a feather to these highly armed, I don't know what they were, law enforcement, but the cover of the book is actually, what they saw. So here they have all their guns, and what they're facing is this young woman who's being surrounded by her community. And this book is spectacular in the way it communicates through the images. If you do watercolor at all, you would recognize this technique as wet on wet. And so not only are the words describing water, but it's literally showing the life force that water is. And so this is a book I cannot say enough wonderful things about. Again, it ties tradition to current day. It talks about agency. It talks about activism. And again, there are so many fabulous books like this. There's one that goes with the 1619 Project that's also full of symbolism and empowerment. So these are just a few that I'm centering on. I'm going to go through a few slides pretty quickly. And again, I hope that you'll explore them more deeply, because I want you to leave here with some ideas. So I've talked a lot about race and identity. Another really important issue for us to explore is ability, because we don't tend to see a lot of characters who, say, have a learning disability, or who are deaf or hard of hearing, or who are blind, or who have autism. And I use these terms in one way. I always encourage you to ask a person, if you are working with a person who has a disability, how do they want to be referred to? So I'm giving you some different ways that you can refer to them, and our vocabulary changes over time. But these are 3 books just that are fabulous resources that show different types of ability issues. And then the link here will send you, the Iris Center will also send you to some more books that are very, very helpful in representing different identities. Inclusion, we can't have enough. I mean, and if you think these books are just for kindergarten, I use them K-12 and into college, and I don't just read to my lit class. So these books can go a long way And yeah, these two have creatures in them. Tacky the Penguin and Wadney Wat are two of my favorite. Well, Tacky is a whole series, and Wadney Wat, it's about a rat who can't say his R's. My 3 kids couldn't say their R's. So we read a lot of Wadney Wat, because if you get to the end of the story of Wadney Wat, he ends up kind of coming out on top. And Tacky the Penguin is just kind of this, he kind of represents all of us who are a little funky, you know. He doesn't toe the line, but again, he has a big heart, and people always learn from him. Chrysanthemum has a really hard name to say, and I'll just leave it at that, because she's a mouse, but there are some stories in the list that I give with other name stories, and then again, The Invisible Boy is about a child who doesn't feel like he's being seen, and The Day You Begin talks about being different when you walk in a room. As you get into some older, higher grade reading, we've got Esperanza Rising, Freak the Mighty, Weed Flower, Maximilian and the La Lucha Libre Club, and All American Boys. All American Boys is violent, and actually, all of these books might be triggering for some children, so you want to make sure you're familiar with the story. But all of these are really brilliant representations of different lived experiences. If you teach in California, Esperanza is incredible, because it gives us a lot of different views on migration, on revolution, on farm workers. And it's also beautifully, beautifully written. And then for nonfiction books, there's so many that are out there now that will give us another view beside the one that we tend to see in publishing. So these are, again, just a few nonfiction books. Again, I have a list that's embedded in these slides that I hope that you'll explore. Graphic novels are not just comic books. And even if they were just comic books, they're still really valuable elements of literature. These are not baby books. Graphic novels are a whole genre that create a reading experience that is so rich, because the pictures and the colors and the space used on the page combined with the words tell a much richer story than any set of words alone is going to do. And so I encourage you, if you hesitate when you see a graphic novel and think of them as a book for kids who don't read, I invite you to take another look at them and to really start to consider how rich of a story they offer our children. In fact, the book on the bottom right corner there, The Arrival, has not a single word in it, but tells one of the most amazing stories. So I invite you to check these out. Persepolis is graphically violent. I would not use that in a situation where you are not able to provide context for it. But you may, if you're in an upper grade, or middle school or high school, that you might find that to be a really powerful tool to help children understand war and even what's going on right now. And They Called Us Enemy is about the Japanese internment camps, which is very relevant to anyone in California. This slide has links to all of the different awards that are out there for children's literature. I would like to say that the Newbery Award has been around the longest, and it's also the widest of all of these. So, oh yeah, American Born Chinese is so complex. It's a really powerful book. I have my students read that in the lit class, and they love it. So I'm gonna wrap up though. So my thing about Newbery is it has a lot of the books that I would no longer offer my students, but it doesn't mean don't use it. I would just say that we're not saying don't teach these books. I'm saying teach them in context and have children interrogate them, have children learn to read critically. But so each of these is a different awards list. I don't have time to go over all of them, but I invite you to explore so you can kind of start getting a sense of what's out there. These are this is a boring slide. I'll add a picture later, but these are just a few links to a few different resources. And I'll actually add a couple that I just thought of. I'll add a couple on here. This is my little running list of annotated bibliography. And then these are other sites that have really great resources. So I'm not going to just give you a list of books. I'm going to let you kind of find out what makes sense for you. I'm going to drop these in the chat. So we would really appreciate it if you could complete this conference survey. And then I also have a little survey if you have time. I know you have a million other things to do. And then I will also drop the link to the chat, or the link to the slides is here. And like I said, I'm going to add to them. So you might want to wait a minute or two till you jump on there. So this is the link to the slides. So is this QR code. And then if you are interested in a certificate or have questions for me, that is my email address right there. I am changing jobs. So right now use this one because it'll get to me even if I'm not checking my Cuesta and Cal Poly emails. And I'm sorry, all I did was talk, but I had so much I wanted to share with you. I'm going to stop my screen share right now. I am not committed to something right after this. So if you want to stay in chat or have questions, I'd love to hear from you. Again, I don't have some big long list of suggestions for you. I want you to go and check out what matters to you. Okay, so use some of those links that I offered. And if you have a topic, you're like, I need a book for this, message me. I might have an idea. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. But I hope that you all enjoy the rest of this conference and get what you came for. And keep in touch with me, please. I'd be happy to connect with you. So have a great rest of your day. And if you have questions, just unmute and ask. Thank you all so much for being here. I'm going to stop our recording.
Hi, Rosemary.
Hi.